Welcome to this Arnold Arboretum virtual tree mob. I am Pam Thompson, Manager of Adult Education. Let's begin with an introduction of our panelists. Our guest, Rachel Bricklin, earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Anthropology Zoology at the University of Michigan and a Master's degree in Ecology and Organismal Biology with Eastern Michigan University, where she researched thermoregulation and behavior of bats in southern Michigan for her thesis. She earned her doctorate with Fordham University with a dissertation on migratory birds in the New York City region. And most recently, she taught a variety of science subjects as faculty at the Windsor School in Boston. Brendan Keegan joined the Arnold Arboretum in 2016 as a seasonal gardener and is now an Arnold Arboretum horticulturist. He also runs the Arnold Arboretum's Nestwatch Citizen Science Program with assistance from the Public Programs Department. He's deeply interested in the value of the Arboretum as an urban habitat, is an avid naturalist and skilled science communicator. He earned a Bachelor of Arts from Rhodes College, has earned a graduate certificate in Natural Resources Management with Harvard Extension School, where he's continuing on to earn his master's degree. Prior to working for the Arnold Arboretum, he served for 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine and spent a year in Punta Gorda, Belize, working with a small sustainable agriculture NGO. Tonight's tree mob, Do Bats Abound, aims to provide evidence of bats that can be found in the Arnold Arboretum. Welcome, Rachel Bricklin.
Excellent. Thank you, Pam. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite groups of animals, about bats, and also to help introduce some of the exciting work to help bats that's going on in the Arboretum. So I'm just gonna take a moment to start some pictures. Bats are an incredibly diverse group of mammals. If you were to choose any species of mammal at random, you'd have a 20% chance of choosing a bat, just to put that in perspective. There are about 6,400 species of mammals, and 1,400 of those are bats. So there's lots and lots of species of bats. Within the bat order, it's divided into two main groups, which is the Megachiroptera and the Microchiroptera. And just to put that in perspective, because you might be thinking of the big bats, the Megachiroptera, which are the flying foxes or the fruit bats, but those are not the bats around here. The bats around here are part of the larger group of Microchiroptera, which can all echolocate and include bats such as the family Vespertilionidae, which is also pretty diverse, but all of our bats around here are part of that family. Can you please go to the next slide? Excellent, thank you. To give you a little bit of background about the ecology of bats in New England. Bats overall are unique because they're the only animals that can truly fly. So there's other animals, only mammals, excuse me, that can truly fly. There's other mammals such as flying squirrels, such as sugar gliders, even flying lemurs that we say can fly, but they're actually really gliding. But bats are the only mammals that can truly sustain flight. And that's related to a lot of their other ecology and behavior. The bats around here are all insectivorous. They're all feeding on different sorts of insects or arthropods. Some of them are migratory. Some of them are going to stay in relatively the same area during the breeding season and then the wintering or hibernation season. And bats are able to use torpor, both short term, which is when they lower their body temperature. They can use it short term during the day, even in the summer, and they can use it longer term during hibernation to help conserve energy. Because when you're lowering your body temperature, you're not using as much energy. So I have some pictures at the top that are some sort of snags or crevices in trees. If you look at the top right picture, you can see there's a lighter area on the picture, and there's a really small little crack or crevice in the tree that there actually were a good number of bats that were roosting in there during the summer. And then bats can also be found in buildings during the summer and during the winter, and also in caves. But a lot of the bats that are roosting in trees during the summertime are spending the winter in caves to hibernate. Can you please advance to the next slide? Thank you. In Massachusetts, we have 9 species of bats. These bats are incredibly important to us because since they're insectivorous, they help with insect control. If you have a good, healthy bat population, you have insect populations that are being controlled by very effective predators. If you don't have healthy bat populations, that can be a problem. If we look, this is actually from the site listing all the bats in Massachusetts. And if you just look through at the status, we have 4 species that are common and then 5 that are listed as state endangered. And the reason that I pull this up is that prior to 2012, we actually only had 1 that was listed as state endangered. It was only the Indiana bat. But because of recent threats to bats that I'll talk about in a moment, unfortunately, all bats populations have been declining, and particularly populations of bats that winter or hibernate in caves in big groups where the temperature is cold and where conditions are wet. So it was surprising to me because I studied bats prior to 2012 that species that were previously really, really common, such as the little brown bat, which is the image that we started with, is now listed as state endangered. Can you please advance to the next slide? Thank you. So what are the threats to our bats? Why do we have more than half of our species currently listed as state endangered, and what can we do about it? Threats to our bats are some of the threats that are threats to all wildlife in general, which is any sort of habitat loss or degradation, also anything that is going to decrease their prey populations. So anything that's going to affect insect abundance, especially moth abundance, can hurt bats, pesticide use, any non-native species that are going to hurt any sort of insect populations. But there are also some threats that are more unique to bats. One of these threats, if you look at the image that has these 4 different images of this wind turbine, these are thermal images of a wind turbine and a bat. Wind turbines are great in some ways because they are a potential source of more sustainable energy, but unfortunately they can be very, very harmful to migrating birds and bats. And the species that migrate can collide and be killed by these blades. They can be killed even if they get too close and if the pressure changes. So these can be detrimental to populations. Another big threat that's actually one of the largest threats, and it has led to 4 of those 5 species now being listed as endangered, is white nose syndrome. So if you look at this picture of a little brown bat hibernating in a cave, you can see it looks like this white fuzzy stuff on its nose and on its wings. And this syndrome is caused by a fungus. It's relatively recently discovered in 2007 in bat hibernacula in New York State. And it unfortunately kills bats by essentially draining their energy reserves or causing them to use up their energy reserves during hibernation. Because the fungus thrives in wet, cold areas, it's particularly prevalent in caves for bats that hibernate in caves, and it can also be spread. So this is unfortunately a problem for bats. But what can we do? Can you please advance to the next slide? Thank you. There's lots of things that we can do, but part of what we can do is to work to better understand bats, to study bats, to learn more about what they need for their populations to thrive, and for us to work to detect bats in particular habitats, determine which aspects of the habitat they're using, and then see how we can potentially modify habitats to encourage bats, which is what's going on at the Arboretum and is really, really exciting. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these methods of detecting bats. Some are more intrusive than others and also labor intensive. And then we'll get to what's specifically happening at the Arboretum for bats. So if you look at the top left picture, you can see some little tiny people and this really big high net. So one way that you can detect bats is that you can actually catch them. So you can go to areas where bats are prevalent. You can find flyways where bats are going to be foraging at night. So it's all going to be night work when the bats are out and active. You can set up large nets. You can catch bats. You can see what bats are present. So this is a red bat that's been captured. Is not so happy about it. It's trying to echolocate, sort of figure out what's going on. And then if you want to know more, you can ban the bats to see if they're recaptured. And you can also track the bats to see where they're going to roost during the day. And one way to do that is you can put, if you look in the top right picture, there's a little radio transmitter. It's pretty small, it's about 0.5 gram. It's got a big wire coming out of it, out of the bottom. You can actually give the bats a little haircut, glue this to the back of a bat. And then when you send the bats off, once they fly around forage and they return to their day roost, then you can go out, if you look in the middle left picture, you can go out with the receiver and an antenna and you stick it up and you're trying to pick up any of the signal that the radio transmitter is transmitting. And if it's not too far away and depending on the conditions, you hear this faint beep, 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 and then you can triangulate. And if you're lucky, eventually find where you think the bat is. Then you come back that evening around sunset to watch where you think the bat is to see, to then verify if the bat's actually coming out of that. Once you find where the bats are roosting, there's some other neat things you can do. And this is just sort of a sampling of different research you can do with bats. Here, if you look in the second to right middle picture, there's a data logger that's actually recording all of the little signals given off by that radio transmitter. So you can tell when the bat is there at the roost and when it's somewhere else. We also, for part of what I used, we use temperature sensitive radio transmitters. So you can actually detect the temperature of the bat and you can see if it was conserving energy by dropping its body temperature at all. You can also trying to figure out what bats are eating. If you look at the middle right picture, there's some nets set up under a roost tree to try to catch bat guano or bat poop, which can later be dissected, and you can look for little insect parts and figure out what these bats are eating. There's also a video camera with an infrared light set up so that we could record the bats at night to see what was coming out of that tree. These methods are great. They're pretty labor intensive and intrusive for both people and bats. But if you look at the bottom, what's actually going on at the Arboretum right now is you can use a bat detector, which will pick up the frequencies that bats are emitting as they're echolocating, as they're flying around, trying to navigate and find insects. This will pick up the frequencies that bats emit, which is much higher than the frequencies that we can hear. And you can hook this little detector up to a device that Brendan will tell us more about this, and you can detect if there's bats present and also try to determine roughly what the type of bats are that are present. Can you please advance to the next slide? So just to show you a little bit about these more intrusive methods. So I actually studied bats in southern Michigan, and I studied a species called the evening bat that's not found in Massachusetts, but it was at the northern edge of its range in Michigan. And we captured these bats. We put these little temperature sensitive radio transmitters on them, and then we would try to figure out which trees they were using as roost trees, how they were using thermoregulation during the day. So were they trying to conserve energy by dropping their body temperature below their active temperature? So if you look at the graph in the middle at the bottom, you can see it was really exciting. You graph your data and figure out, okay, what are these bats doing? Are they going into this daily torpor or daily hibernation? I was also video recording these bats. And if we were lucky, we would see bats. So you can see this is actually a still image from a video where this bat is emerging from the tree. So it's circled in orange from that little crevice where it came out of. So again, these methods are great, but labor intensive and involves handling the bats, which the bats do not like. They get a radio transmitter, they try to rip them off their backs. They're always grooming each other. You find them at the base of trees. They don't like it. But at the Arboretum, how I got connected with the Arboretum is that I had actually asked Brendan to come speak to my class and to come help us identify trees by the Muddy River, which was one of my students' favorite class of the entire year. And then I started talking to him about initiatives at the Arboretum, and he was telling me about wildlife work that was going on. And we were talking about potential work to encourage bats, because he'd really been wanting to encourage bats at the Arboretum. So we were talking about ways to detect bats, and you might be able to use a bat detector, which he was able to get. And then he's going to tell us about some of these initiatives that he was able to do at the Arboretum. I'm just going to show you a little bit of the next slide just to give you some visuals to go with what Brendan's saying, what's going to tell you, and then he'll tell you some more specifics about what's going on and see if he can detect some bats. So can you please advance to the next slide? If you look in the four corners, these are the 4 out of 9 species of bats in Massachusetts that Brendan has been able to detect as probably present at the Arboretum. You see in the upper left, there's the big brown bat. In the upper right is the red bat. The lower right is the silver-haired bat, and then the lower left is the hoary bat. These stars on the map of the Arboretum are just showing some areas where he's been able to detect a good amount of bat activity. So if you're able to go out and then sort of see what the habitat looks like if you go during the day, it's kind of neat things to see. What I'll do now is I want to turn this over to Brendan to talk more about specifically what's going on there.
Thank you. I'll just let you take it away, Brendan, and
Sure.
maybe you'll go outside and show us the batometer. All right?
Sure, sounds good. As far as what Rachel was talking about, some of the things that we're doing at the Arboretum, really it started with chatting with Rachel about, what habitat is useful for bats. So for example, for bats, in order to live in an urban area such as Boston, they have to have a place to roost. So as Rachel pointed out, having nooks and crannies in trees, many bats like to roost during the summer underneath bark or in crevices or in snags. And so some of the things that the Arboretum has just right off the bat in an urban area, which is kind of unusual, is an abundance of trees of different ages, of different conditions, some of them alive and some of them dead. And some of the things that we've been doing more and more at the Arboretum to encourage wildlife of all sorts, including bats, is leaving more dead and damaged trees. So if you've come to the Arboretum recently, you've probably seen some snags that have been left up in the landscape. These snags are, can take the form of trees that have potentially been delimbed, but left there for wildlife to use, or also trees that are in decline, but the arborists are slowing down their removal in order to leave them as habitat. So a lot of the things that we as horticulturalists or arborists dislike in plants, such as broken branches or damage, a lot of other critters such as bats really appreciate. Another thing that makes the Arboretum a pretty good habitat for bats is kind of an abundance of water sources throughout the grounds. So whether it's the wet meadow across from our visitor center, or the ponds in the rose garden, or especially the streams and the seep in our conifer collection, bats tend to really like being around areas that have sources of water. Now this is probably because that's where a lot of insects come out during the evening. It's a good source of food. So open fields near water are really good places to look for bats. So saying all this, for the last couple of years, I've known bats were in the landscape, and most of the horticulturalists and arborists have actually, many of them have seen bats on the trees or in the shrubs, but we didn't have any inclination or any idea of what species were actually in the landscape. And so talking with Rachel, one of the reasons I went to teach her classes in order to get her feedback and some kind of assistance as to how we can better understand these populations in our landscape. And Rachel recommended this really useful tool, which I'm going to try and flip my screen around. Really useful tool, here it is, called the echometer, or as Pam likes to call it, the batometer. I guess you can call it either one, it works. And how this functions, just like Rachel said, you can plug it into your phone, you can plug it into a tablet, and it records the echolocations of bats as they're flying through the landscape. And not only does it record them, obviously they're echolocating at frequencies beyond our ability to hear. It also translates them into frequencies that we can hear, which is both fun because when you're walking through a night landscape and it's nice and quiet, if you plug in this echometer, you can all of a sudden hear all the noises that we're missing out on, that other critters in the landscape are emitting. And two, it's very useful because different species of bats communicate and echolocate using different frequencies. So if you can capture the frequencies of bats with this echometer, there's a good chance that you can actually tell which species are flying around. And as Rachel pointed out, this is a really nice way of determining what species are in an area without the more intrusive methods of netting or capturing them or tagging them. So it's an unintrusive method of bat surveying. And most of the surveying we've done so far this summer has just been, I'd say it's nothing statistical. So walking around the Arboretum, taking the batometer on walks and just trying to see what we pick up. And most of the things, as Rachel and Pam pointed out, they have 4 very common species in Massachusetts at least. So we have the big brown bats, eastern red bats, hoary bats, and then the silver-haired bats. I'm just going to show you on another phone what the recording looks like. So we'll be looking at, let's see, we'll be looking at a recording of a bat call in the Arboretum. As still as I can. So on the top line, this is called a waveform, the red line there. And that line is essentially just measuring the loudness of a call or the amplitude of the bat call. On the bottom is the spectrogram. So spectrograms measure the frequency. So it allows you to see the specific, you can say like the notes that the bat is echolocating in. So I'm going to play it so you'll be able to see what the amplitude, what the waveform and the spectrogram look like. And then we'll look at the type of bat that this call, or this echolocation is associated with. We'll see how it goes. So again, on the top, you can see the waveform. On the bottom, you can see the spectrogram. And you can listen, this is called a real-time expansion. So this is a software program that is taking in the frequency of the bat echolocation and essentially slowing it down and compressing it so that it makes sense to human ears. So this is roughly what a bat echolocation would sound like if you could hear it. And so this is the app that we have, the Echometer app. And so essentially what this app allows you to do is, again, to look at the frequencies, and then it gives you an estimation of which species that is. So if you can see in here, it gives 2 species that this could be a big brown bat or the silver-haired bat. I don't know, it's probably impossible to see, but underneath the big brown bat, it says a pulse reading of 95 out of 131. And what that means is that the software has analyzed 131 pulses, or echo, as the bat is echolocating, it registers these as pulses, and it matches those pulses to a database, and then it makes the best prediction based off that database as far as what the species could be. So we'll play it one more time. And so if you're a really good bat expert, probably like Rachel, you could look at a spectrogram of the frequency and actually be able to tell which species is calling without the assistance of this kind of a software. Let's see, so that was a big brown bat. I'm gonna find one more. Is that okay, Pam? Is this short enough?
I can talk about them a little bit if you want.
Yeah, would you mind? Yeah, great.
I know so bats can be emitting different sort of calls if they're just flying or if they're trying to, they've kind of honed in on a moth, let's say, and they're trying to capture it. It can sometimes be a little tricky to figure out which species is which because the frequencies definitely overlap. You don't always know exactly sort of what vocalization the bat's making, but they can emit lots of frequencies per second. So it's really, really fast. So when we get it to a point that we can actually hear, it just sounds like this, it's this high frequency, really, really fast. So when we hear it, that's why it sounds like it sounds a little crazy.
And it's an example of that. This is another species. So this is, let's see. This is the eastern red bat. So as you're looking at this, again, it can be fairly hard to hear. But it's very distinct from the big brown bat. So let's try this one. So that's barely audible. So it's a lower frequency, slightly slower call. And this is the hoary bat. And maybe we'll end it here because this one is actually one of the harder ones to make out. So again, if you're looking at the waveform in the spectrogram, it's a much lower frequency. And a much slower tempo as well. And so as Rachel was saying, different bats have, echolocated at different speeds depending on where they are. And probably, Rachel, would you say like depending on the environment that they're hunting in?
Yeah.
So if they're in a very cluttered environment versus in a very open one, you'd probably get different types of echolocation pickups.
Right. How is it, Brendan? How is it walking around in the environment trying to detect bats? Like, would you go long periods and no bats, and then all of a sudden you would detect something?
Actually, the Arboretum, no, it's actually fairly constant.
Neat.
So it's impossible to tell using this kind of software how many are in an area. It could just be one that is just doing circles over the top.
Mhm.
But in the times that I've been walking through the landscape. So for example, starting at the conifer collection and then walking back to my home in Rosendale. So from the conifers through Peters Hill, it's essentially nonstop the whole way. So picking up one species or the other. Usually big brown bats are the most common, but it seems like on Peters Hill there are, again, purely anecdotal, but more pickups of hoary bats and silver-haired bats than big browns.
Thank you.
Do you want to say one last thing, Rachel?
I hope at some point we can do an actual bat exploration of the Arboretum. But until then, I hope that people are able to get out if you're able to and look for bats wherever it is that you are. It's a nice way to socially distance. It's at night, so it's fewer people are going to be out. And it's so exciting. You always look, as the sun's going down, you can see all the birds flying around. And then, maybe some chimney swifts, which fly a little bit like bats, so you got to be careful. And then you start seeing, you can see some more jagged flight, which is really neat. And that's when the bats come out. And it's so exciting when you first see them. So I hope everybody's able to get out sometime soon and see them.
Yeah, I would echo that. Hopefully we can get out in the landscape soon so everybody can actually use this tool and see and hear the echolocations for yourselves.
Yeah, that would be great. And a great resource for bat information is Bat Conservation International. You can Google the white nose syndrome and get all sorts of research information on that if you're curious in pursuing more of that.
Yeah, there should be some on the USGS or US Geological Survey site. There's some work on white nose syndrome.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and if you're interested in the echometer, I think it's Wildlife Acoustics is the company that produces them. So if you're looking for citizen science projects this summer, it's a good place to start.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you go see some bats.
Yay.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye. Okay. Of the 9 species, are there estimates of their seasonal population sizes? You may or may not know that.
That's an excellent question. I don't know numbers. I know that all species are sadly declining, and that I know that there's millions of individual bats that have been killed by white nose syndrome. I can sort of give estimates in terms of numbers that we'd catch or numbers that would be in roost trees, but unfortunately I don't know offhand the population sizes.
Okay. There's some very specific, funny questions here.
Okay.
Here's, can you give us an update on white nose syndrome and its effects on bats in Massachusetts? We know you said in the beginning that they're now endangered, and they weren't, what, 12 years ago? Is that right?
Well, they at least weren't, they were listed as endangered in 2012, to the best of my knowledge. And white nose syndrome was first discovered in about the winter of 2007. So that's not great in terms of how fast it's moved. But I mean, the good news is that there are a lot of people studying white nose syndrome within the past, maybe I think 5 years or so. Researchers are starting to discover how white nose syndrome specifically affects bats, that it seems to specifically be causing them to use up their energy reserves. So there's lots, of initiatives to try to protect bats, closing off any sort of hibernacula to people, because white nose syndrome likely first was brought over from Europe by likely people going in to caves where bats were. So in terms of kind of how bats are doing specifically in the state and what's happening with white nose syndrome, it's not great news, but the good news is what people are doing to try to help the bats, and some of that is right here in the Arboretum.
Okay. Do bats overwinter in the Arboretum, or do they migrate somewhere else?
Interesting question. Most likely not. So there's the bats such as little brown bats, big brown bats, long-eared bats, or tricolored bats that are going to overwinter in some sort of caves or buildings are probably going to, even they're not really considered migratory, but they're probably going to fly short distances to find other places to overwinter where their temperature can stay a little more consistent. And then other species that are more migratory, such as red bats or hoary bats, are probably going to fly further south where they could overwinter or they could hibernate, really stay in trees where the temperature would be a little bit more consistent. So unless there's a particular building that bats are hibernating in, I don't know if you've ever found anywhere that the temperature would probably have to stay pretty consistent throughout the winter, they're probably not hibernating in the Arboretum.
Okay. Someone says they saw a bat flying and foraging one day at lunchtime. Does that mean it's a sick bat?
Okay, that if it was in the middle of the day?
Yeah.
Usually you don't see bats in the middle of the day. That being said, if it's flying and foraging and looks healthy, it definitely, and if it's this time of year when bats are pretty active, I mean, there's a lot of bats that have recently been born, a lot of young bats. They might be doing something a little strange. I mean, you know, as a general rule, you never want to handle a bat. You want to let the bat do its thing. But if it's flying around and foraging, it could just be a little, that is a strange time. But it potentially could be.
Okay. Let's see. Were you ever concerned about rabies, and are there species that have rabies more prevalent in them that you are working with than others?
I have had so many rabies vaccines that I started to feel invincible in a way that you never should, that I would, you know, see a mouse in my house and go, I'm going to pick it up with my hands, and then go, no, 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 you know, you don't want to do that. Because we were catching healthy bats that were out foraging and they were, you know, clearly moving around and doing pretty well. And, you know, we were using gloves as best we could and trying to avoid being bitten. There's even more protocols now because of white nose syndrome. I was not concerned. That means that so overall in bat populations, there's a very, very low percentage of bats that do have rabies. That being said, if a bat does have rabies, it's going to exhibit strange behaviors. It's more likely to be sort of crawling around if it's in a building active during the day. So of the bats that you encounter, particularly if they're acting strangely, it could be more likely to be sick or to have something. So I would not handle, using gloves, just be as careful as possible, but I would try to avoid handling any bat that I were to find when I'm not out there looking for healthy bats. But when we were out there, we had, you know, these big nets strung up along where the bats were foraging, and those bats had a pretty high chance of not carrying rabies.
Okay. All kinds of questions. So someone was seeing lots of bats in Cambridge. Where would they be living? They live in the eaves of houses and anywhere they can find a place, right? Any little hole they can sneak into.
Yeah.
Not just trees.
Wherever the temperature is good, wherever there's lots of insects. They like to forage in areas where there's water. So if you see them in the evening, more often than not, there's going to be some water nearby, especially a waterway or some sort of flyway that they could forage along. But yeah, they could definitely be in buildings there. That's neat to see them in Cambridge.
Yeah. Brendan, can you say something about bat houses and
Absolutely.
those are effective?
So part of the reason of doing this kind of informal bat survey is, one, just to see whether there are bats in the landscape, and two, if we put up bat houses, where should we place them? I think I saw a question in the chat about are bat houses effective, and I think Rachel would agree that a lot of the evidence is kind of out. It depends on the location, and it depends a lot on your bats. The thing, if you do want to put up a bat house, you can follow some good best practices though, and you know, if you follow these, you will increase the likelihood that you will get bats into your bat house. And a couple of these are one that you should put them in places that get a lot of sun, especially in the morning. Two, you should put them away from trees. This might seem kind of counterintuitive. So if you think of bats roosting in natural habitats on tree trunks or in the leaves, you want to put your bat house actually away from trees, or definitely not on one, because the closer you put it to a tree, the more likely it is to attract predators, especially if more and more bats start using that bat house. It's more likely to attract predators that might seek them out in those areas. So warm areas, away from trees, usually in fields, and again, near wet areas, near ponds or near streams, are places where bats are more likely to be anyways, and places that they're more likely to use bat houses if you install them. And I'm just gonna talk just a little bit more about the echolocation. One of the amazing things about bats, as Rachel was mentioning, is that they communicate and they find their prey using really rapid ultrasonic frequencies that they essentially ping out into the landscape, and they hear the reverberations and then use those to target insects, moths, beetles that are flying around in the night sky. And something that I think, you know, perhaps Rachel can talk a little bit more about is that if you think of bats hunting, it's a really incredibly effective way of hunting. So they have this, you know, we can look at our Narvi as like the superpower that they're able to see in the dark using their echolocations. But in New England, at least, I think it's really fascinating that bats aren't the only creatures that have this skill, and that there are a number of organisms in the environment that actually have evolved to counter the echolocation skill. So tiger moths are a good example in New England of an organism that actually, when they hear the echolocation of a bat, they can actually ping a response that disorients the bat, that, you know, tells the bat that there's nothing there, that the bat is actually, it's going to miss if it comes after it. So I think it's very interesting that, you know, while we are, you know, again, walking around in a nice peaceful evening, there's all sorts of this kind of sonic warfare going on just outside of our ability to hear, which is really fascinating aspects of bat and their ecology. Rachel, do you have anything else that you could add about their hunting?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, it's neat that there's a great example of coevolution with the bats and their prey, where there's these sort of competing selective pressures on both the bats and the moths, for the bats to be able to better detect prey and to be able to get them faster and faster, and for the moths to be able to, you know, escape from these bats. So it's just pretty neat. And I mean, bats, because of their maneuverability and their great ability to fly, you know, people have studied bats to determine how we can make better, you know, fighter planes, or how humans can exploit the what we learn about flight from bats, because they're so effective. And in order to be flying around at night, bats can see, but that's not their primary sense. They're primarily using echolocation both to navigate and not crash into a tree, and also to catch flying prey that's trying to escape from them at the same time. So it's really neat. The bat detectors are great. We just would use a general bat detector when we were catching bats in nets, because it was dark and it was hard to see if there was a bat in the net. But if there's a bat in the net, they're going to be vocalizing. So you have a bat detector set up and you can hear it go like, if there's a bat stuck somewhere in the net, and then you go over and it's something else, or it's whatever. And it was very exciting, like, oh, I think we got a bat. So they can be used to detect what's there.
What are the predators of bats? I know domestic cats are predators.
Yeah. They have both flying and terrestrial predators. So, you know, owls, hawks, especially as bats emerge, can prey on bats. I guess around here, snakes, I mean, especially if young bats are gonna fall from things. Anything that would eat a small mammal. white-footed mice are known to sometimes opportunistically prey on bats, and I would sometimes see mice in my videos that were coming out of the same crevices as bats, and it wasn't known were they competing for the same spots or were they predators. There can definitely be a lot. Yeah, I was just reading a nature book with my daughter yesterday about centipedes and millipedes, and this wouldn't necessarily be the bats around here, but with giant centipedes kind of hanging from caves, sometimes feeding on bats. So they do have, predation is not usually a major issue in terms of, you know, harming populations, but they do have a number of predators.
Are they do they always live in groups, or are they individualistic?
No, so some do, some don't. That's a great question, because the bats that Brendan's detecting, actually some are solitary and some will roost in groups. So the bats that I was studying, at least the females, roost in these maternity colonies, or sort of multiple bats during the summer, and a lot of bats will hibernate together in the winter, but red bats tend to be solitary, and both kind of summer breeding season and winter, and they'll just kind of hang from a tree. Hoary bats are more solitary. Silverhairs could be in groups. Big brown bats are usually in groups, but it could vary based on the species of bat. And also based on males and females show different behaviors sometimes during the breeding season, or during the reproductive season. They actually breed off, a lot of species of bats around here breed a different time of year than they are actually fertilized and give birth. A lot of them breed in the fall. There's delayed fertilization until the spring. And then there's like a gestation period, and then they give birth in the spring, but males and females could be separate.
Do you know what a typical bat lifespan is for our New England bats?
Oh, I should know off the top of my head, and I even studied with the pipistrelle. So one general statement about lifespan of bats is that they do in general have a longer lifespan than other small mammals of equivalent size. So, you know, a mouse might live 1 to 2 years, they max. A bat could live much longer, you know, potentially 10 years or more, depending on if they survive. So the bat that we had recorded, I want to say it was 11 or 12 years since we had first banded it. This was a pipistrelle tricolored bat. This was in Michigan. So they can be relatively long-lived for a small mammal, but not compared to a human lifespan.
Great. In terms of water and bats living near water sources, do they need to be, you know, within a couple of 100 feet? Do they need to be within a mile? They fly around a lot, so, you know, what would their radius be away from their home?
So generally, when bats are foraging, they're going to forage along some sort of flyway. So whether that is some ideally continuous habitat. So whether that's all, you know, water if they're following a river, or if it's a river and then some forested area and then maybe to another river where there's lots of insects. Anecdotally, I think I told Pam and Brendan that I went for a walk last night around the time when I should have seen bats near where I live, and which is not near water, and I did not see bats. But when I have walked areas that are, you know, within a few blocks of water with sort of equivalent housing densities, I do more consistently see bats. So take that for what you will anecdotally. But, you know, you definitely could see bats in an area that's not right by water if there's a continuous habitat and if there's high insect abundance. But whenever we were catching them, we were by the water in very high insect abundance areas. I don't know if you noticed from the pictures, but sort of wearing mosquito netting and sort of full gear to protect from the mosquitoes.
That was not to keep bats out of your hair. It was to keep
mosquitoes
off of you.
No.
Right.
That was if you were lucky when you're watching a roost tree, you get a dragonfly buddy that would hang out in front of you and eat all the mosquitoes as you watch the roost tree. But otherwise, you're going like this constantly and trying to lift up your net so you can see the bats. It was fun, but, you know, full of mosquitoes.
And the water has to be fresh water, is that correct? Rather than salt water?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah. I don't know if that's
There's
near
often
or-
brackish water near salt water, or go in a little bit and you find kettle ponds and things.
Yeah. As far as I know, sort of best areas for finding bats when I was both studying them and just if I wanted to go find them would be the areas that you would tend to avoid if you didn't want to be bitten by a mosquito.
So if you are being eaten alive by mosquitoes, look for bats.
It could be good.
And are bats affected by poisons or toxins, either natural or human-made?
Yeah, definitely. They could be affected both if the toxins are affecting their prey source and decreasing that population, or if they're ingesting the toxins just like any organism, you know, depending on the toxin, it could build up in their tissues and that could be fatal for sure.
Mhm. And then one last question and we'll switch back to Brendan. Someone's saying that they heard about a disease that was reported several years ago that was devastating a certain bat population. Was that likely the smutty nose, or was there a different disease?
Yeah, I'm assuming that's white nose syndrome because that's sort of the big emergent disease in bats that's been detrimental.
Okay. Do the same species compete for living space, or do they tend to live happily in the same area?
Well, I would love to see a bat fight. That would be exciting to see. Big brown bats and little brown bats we would sometimes find in the same sort of barns, usually in different locations. I would assume usually if a bat is looking for a roost site, if it's a different species and it's going to a site and there's a bat there, it's probably going to be pushed out, or, you know, depending on which bat it is. But that, yeah, I haven't seen too much. You don't get to always see as much sort of, it's hard to see bat behavior because they're either flying or they're at night. But I would love to see different bats interact like that.